a transfer one day, high school kids the next. Pitt's just adding guys all over the place. Commitment city for the last 2 days, right? Last 48 hours. It's all about Pitt getting new players. They got a transfer on Sunday with Chief Borders, the defensive end from Nebraska, committing. And then yesterday, 2 high school prospects announced that they were committing to Pitt. Well, they made their commitments. Pat Narduzzi tweeted it that they were making their commitments, and then those 2 guys announced it. You can see it right there. Tony Kinsler, Shep Turk, one guy local, one guy from Florida. And 2 more additions to Pitt's 2025 recruiting class. These are guys who are finishing up their junior years of high school. They'll be seniors in the fall, which means they will arrive at Pitt in June of 2025, or maybe earlier. I have to check and see if either of these guys can enroll early in January 2025. Doesn't matter. That's a long way off. What's important right now is that Pitt is building its recruiting class. Now they're up to 5 guys in the class, with certainly going to keep growing. Particularly next month when they have the official visits and the June recruiting heats up. But even maybe sooner than that, wouldn't be surprised if they get another 1 or 2 guys, maybe more, before the end of May. So you're starting to see some of those recruiting results come in, on top of getting the transfer on top of getting the transfer on Sunday. Are we calling it momentum? We're going to say the Pitt's got a little bit of momentum now. That's up to you and what your perception is, but certainly they've been able to convince a transfer to get on board and now 2 high school guys to get on board. Let's talk about what Shep Turk and Tony Kinsler are bringing to the Panthers, how they'll fit in with Pitt's offense, because they're both offensive players, and what it means for the recruiting class and the Panthers going forward. We got a lot of recruiting talk here on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, didn't necessarily see 2 commitments coming yesterday, but that's how it happens sometimes. Kind of comes out of nowhere. A little bit of surprise on Sunday with Mother's Day, with Chief Borders committing the transfer from Nebraska, and then a couple more surprises yesterday. I think, in the case of Tony Kinsler and Shep Turk, both were guys that, I think we thought Pitt was in good shape with. Turk as a local guy at Thomas Jefferson, and then Kinsler as kind of an all-purpose offensive weapon in Florida, but somebody who had put Pitt pretty high on his list and seemed, he had recently announced an official visit to Pitt for June. And so it seemed like the Panthers were in strong shape there. It was just a question of how strong. It turned out they were in stronger shape than we anticipated, and they end up landing the commitment. Of course, lots of coverage of both of those guys right there at Panther-Lair.com. You know the website. You should be there if you're a Pitt fan. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt sports news and coverage, football, basketball, and recruiting, and message boards where people are talking about Shep Turk and Tony Kinsler. You never know how the reactions are going to be to commitments. And I think there are a number of ways that you can sort of look at a commitment. And there's different ways you can evaluate a recruit. I think there are different things you can use to evaluate a recruit. You can go by the rankings that Rivals produces, or any of the other networks that are out there. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like we're the only show in town. You can go by that. You can go by the stars and the rankings, and there are certainly times where I think that stuff is relevant. You can go by the offer sheets, and that's always a really interesting barometer of where a recruit stands, even if, sometimes it gets a little bit dicey about what's real and what's not, and how legitimate some offers are and other offers aren't, or whatever it may be. But when it comes down to it, I mean, I think most of the offers that guys cite are pretty genuine. And so you can go by that, and that's an interesting measure of where a recruit kind of stacks up. And then you can also sort of use your own eyes. And look, none of us, there might be football coaches watching this, but most of us, as far as I know, are not millionaire football coaches, either in college football or the NFL or wherever it may be. And so we're not going to pretend to have the sharpest eye for evaluation, but we can watch and see if a guy's fast, see if a guy can throw the ball far, see if he makes big tackles or big blocks or whatever it may be. We have a loose idea of what competent football playing looks like, right? I'll never forget Paul Christ. One time when there was a big to-do, a big kerfluffle on the message boards about Paul Christ sending his defensive line coach to go look at a quarterback to do an in-person evaluation. I remember asking him one time, I was like, look, like what do you what are you looking for here? He was like, he's like, look, I watched the video of the whatever quarterback, and I know what I think of that. I just need somebody to go out and make sure it's actually happening in person, that it's not a doctored film, or you get there in person and you see something completely different from what you saw on film. I just want to confirm that what you're seeing in person is what you saw on film. And so he was like, I could send you, and I mean, like saying this to me, and I mean, I'm an idiot. I have no idea of any of these kinds of things. I have no eye for talent evaluation or whatever, but I can tell if a guy can throw the ball far. I can tell tell if a guy throws wobbly ducks or one hops of receivers or whatever it may be. And I think that was his point, is like, what good football looks like. You may not be able to get the finer details and finer points, but most of us can tell if a guy is, let's say an offensive lineman like Shep Turk is putting all the defensive linemen on their asses, right? I mean, we can tell if he's like getting to the second level and beating the defensive linemen and getting to the linebackers and driving those guys back 10 yards. I mean, we can see these things, right? There's finer stuff that coaches have to look for, and little cues that I think help them project what a guy will be in 10 years, or not 10 years, in 5 years or 4. But I think we can generally tell, you and I can generally tell what is a good football player. And so that's sort of another thing you look at. And you can look at stats and accolades and things like that. And I think it all, coming back to our conversation of how we like evaluate a recruit, or when you find out, somebody got a commitment or they offered a new guy, what do we actually think of this guy? You take all that information together. You know what I mean? It's all little different pieces of information. And some of it may weigh more than others. You may put more stock in the offer sheet. You may put more stock in the rankings. You may put more stock in your own eyes. You may put more stock in statistics, whatever it may be. You take all those pieces together and you form your opinion based on that. So we look at these guys, the two guys who committed yesterday, and I can see the appeal. I think they look like pretty good prospects. Tony Kinsler, he's 5'11", 165-pound, really a versatile, do everything, offensive weapon. Let's call his position offensive weapon is what it really comes down to. Rivals list him as what they call an all-purpose back, which is different from a running back. It's a guy who lines up in the backfield and he moves out and plays in the slot, or he goes out wide. Quadri Henderson was an all-purpose back prospect. That's a name that I'm going to mention here a couple times as we talk about Tony Kinsler. And Kinsler ended up last season for Spruce Creek High School in Port Orange, Florida. He had 24 rushing attempts and 64 receptions. So obviously he was catching the ball more than he was carrying it. But on his 24 rushing attempts, he averaged more than 13 yards per carry and scored 14 touchdowns. Scored 4 touchdowns. And then on his receptions, he caught 64 passes for more than 1,000 yards and 12 more scores. He led his team in all-purpose yards, just between the rushing and the receiving. He had 1,372 all-purpose yards, or They didn't put any of the kick return or punt return yards for any of his teammates, but if you just compare rushing and receiving yards, he led the team. He had 1,372. The next closest was a guy who had 761, and he was more of a running back, had 659 rushing yards. The only guy, if you look at total yards where they include the passing yards, the only guy who had more total yards last year for Spruce Creek than Tony Kinsler was his quarterback, who threw for 1,866 yards. To go over 2,000 yards of total offense. But like I say, he had 1,866 passing yards. 1,050 of those went to Tony Kinsler. Kinsler is a playmaker. I mean, plain and simple. Averaged more than 16 yards per catch, 95.5 yards per game. Yeah, like I say, he scored 12 receiving touchdowns in addition to the 4 rushing touchdowns that he had. And when you watch his film, I mean, he's just a playmaker. They do whatever they can to get the ball in his hands. He lines up in the slot. He lines up in the backfield. He motions out of the backfield. He motions from the slot. He lines up out wide. He's in trip sets, and he's all over the place. He really does a little bit of everything. It's just get the ball in his hands, and you can see why when you watch the film. He's breaking tackles. He's making guys miss, and he's taking off and getting into the end zone. And he does, and I went back to watch some of Quadri Henderson's senior film a little bit just to get a refresher, and I mean, there's similarities there. I can see some similarities. They didn't really have Quadri Henderson taking handoffs out of the backfield, not even on like sweeps or things like that. And maybe a little bit on sweeps. He was mostly a receiver, lining up in the slot, lining up out wide, and obviously his exploits on kick returns. Tony Kinsler is a little bit taller than Quadri, maybe a little bit slower, but not much. And you see a lot of the same ability to dodge and evade tacklers and keep a play alive. Just a difficult guy to get down, a difficult guy to stop. And that's what Quadri Henderson was, and that's what Tony Kinsler reminds me of a little bit. Now, of course, you take Tony Kinsler and you take Bryce Yates, who committed previously, and I think we list him at 6 foot. You do see the continuing trend of smaller wide receivers in this offense with Cade Bell. I mean, these guys are probably taller than C.J. Lee and Raphael Williams, but not by much. And it sort of it tracks. You know what I mean? It follows the same kind of mold. And I think, Bell would tell you he would rather have the smaller guys who are fast and quick and flexible and athletic than a taller guy who maybe loses something in terms of speed. And I get that. I understand that. It does make a lot of sense. But at the same time, you do need size every now and then. And right now, Pitt's recruiting class, they've already got 2 receivers committed. Depending on how you want to classify Kinsler, and maybe if they classify him as more of a do-everything athlete that, gives them the flexibility to sign another receiver. They only signed 2 last year, right? Cam Montero, who enrolled early, and trying to bring up the scholarship board or the recruiting class, because he was the late addition. Tyreek Robinson, that's right. He committed in January and signed. So he was the late addition to the class, a guy who Cade Bell, prioritized and really went after. But so they only signed 2 receivers. They obviously had that big class of 4 receivers 2 years ago with Lamar Seymour and Kenny Johnson and Izzy Polk and Zion Fowler-El. Polk is already gone. Johnson didn't redshirt, although that's probably a moot point. I don't think you get too concerned about redshirts anymore. But they signed a lot in that class, but they're already down 1. Johnson has moved on, is now a sophomore. The other 2 remaining, Seymour and Fowler-El, are redshirt freshmen, and you brought in only 2 receivers in last year's recruiting class. So, I could see them going for a bigger class of wide receivers in this group, in this year, in 2025, the 2025 recruiting class, I should say. And so maybe there's an opportunity there to get a little more versatility, different body types, different skill sets. I think Yates and Kinsler so far they're explosive guys. They're guys that could go downfield, but you're just trying to get the ball to them and let them make plays, which is a big part of what this offense, I think, is predicated on. I know they talk about being vertical and taking shots and attacking, but I think they're really built on getting the ball to the playmakers and letting them make plays. I think that's the goal and the objective, and I think Kinsler looks like the kind of guy who can do that in addition to Yates. And then later came the commitment of Shep Turk, Thomas Jefferson Jaguar, the first TJ player to commit to Pitt since Devin Danielson and Noah Palmer in the recruiting class of 2018. Even though Danielson just finished his career at Pitt last year, it was a really, really it was 7 years ago when he committed. So it's been a long time since the Thomas Jefferson player committed to Pitt. Hasn't been that long since the Thomas Jefferson player played for Pitt. But, I'll be honest. TJ is just one of those schools, man, that you like having guys from that school. And I know maybe Devin Danielson's career didn't live up to the expectations when he committed. Obviously, Noah Palmer ended up transferring to Duquesne. But, you just don't mess with TJ guys. When I first started covering Pitt, you go back to the mid 2000s, there were some guys that you just knew on the team. You just knew that nobody messed with them. And if they did, it was probably to their own detriment. Nobody messed with the McKillop brothers. Chris and Scott. You just didn't do it. You go back before that, nobody messed with Rod Rutherford. Rod Rutherford was the guy that nobody would mess with, and everybody wanted on their side. And you go forward a little bit, and the Nix brothers, Lucas and Nate from Thomas Jefferson, are at Pitt. And, nobody messed with those guys, especially Nate. But, both of those guys. Nobody messed with them. And it's funny because I'm not sure who those guys are on this year's team. I was thinking about that this spring. I'm not sure who those guys are, but I think Thomas Jefferson is a good place to find those kinds of guys. Just guys who are mean, who will brawl, and they'll give it to you. You know, and I think when you watch Shep Turk's film from TJ from this past year, and by all accounts, he's a great kid. You know what I mean? Like I'm, you know, obviously local guy. A lot of people know him. A lot of people have opinions on him, and personal interactions with him. And by all accounts, he's a great kid. But you watch his tape where he's playing offensive tackle, and he seems to move between left tackle and right tackle for TJ. I mean, he's just killing guys. I mean, there's plays he's driving defensive linemen. In a red zone play, driving them out of the back of the end zone. There's one play where he just dropped the D lineman. This was in a red zone play. I forget what it was, but it was on his highlights. Gets the D lineman down and just basically runs around looking for someone else to hit, and finally finds a poor linebacker and he knocks that guy out. He's got that kind of mean streak that. That the good ones from TJ really have. And I think Devin Daniels had some elements of that. I mean, you saw him hitting himself in the head with a helmet. But Shep Turk also really successful wrestler, which is something you always like to see in a lineman, defensive lineman or offensive lineman, because it shows they've got some understanding of leverage, of how to use leverage, of how to get low, of how to get another guy off his feet, right? If you're a good wrestler, that's what you're doing. You're getting guys on the ground. And if you're a good lineman, that's what you're doing, is getting guys on the ground, particularly offensive linemen. You know, I think defensive linemen, it's important to understand leverage and how to use that to your advantage. Offensive linemen, it's important to be able to get guys on the ground. And you watch Shep Turk's film, that's what he does. 6'5", 275-pound tackle prospect. Looks like he'll probably play tackle at Pitt. Could potentially play guard. I mean, depending on how it works out. I mean, shoot, he looks like he could probably play defensive tackle. But I think he's a good fit on the offensive side of the ball. You know, good fit as an offensive tackle, potentially an offensive guard. And either way, I think a pretty good ad from a school that you would like to be in on. You know what I mean? A school where you'd like to keep good relationships. I don't know if I'd say they've been strained at points over the years, but there have been times when you said, what's going on with TJ? It's a little weird. But here's a local guy. Somebody Pitt prioritized, and they were able to land him. So Panthers now have 5 commitments in the 2025 recruiting class. Turk is the first offensive lineman. Kinsler, like I say, I mean, if you want to count him as a wide receiver, Rivals list him as all-purpose back. Basically the second offensive skill guy, non-quarterback offensive skill guy, because they also have Mason Heinschel, the quarterback from Oregon, Ohio. And then Trevor Summers, the defensive end from Florida, was the first commitment. He got that all started in the first week of February. So they got one commitment in February. They got one in March. They got one in April. And now they've got 2 in May. Like I say, I think they'll probably add more before the month ends, and then June will come, and there'll be a big blow up of commitments, as there always are. So 2 commitments for Pitt came in yesterday. I like both of these guys. I think you can see the appeal. I think you can see, I think Kinsler very much fits the mold of what Cade Bell seems to be looking for in a wide receiver, and Shep Turk fits the mold of what I think a lot of coaches would like to have in their offensive linemen. So 2 good ads for Pitt, and we'll see where they go next. Of course, stay tuned to Panther-Lair.com for all the coverage. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, and right here on YouTube, we'll be talking about everything that happens. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like this video and subscribe. You don't miss any of our Pitt video content. It's always a good time. We always have good things to talk about. Don't forget, we have our live stream tomorrow night at, I think we're at 8 o'clock. I think we'll be back to 8 o'clock, yeah. So we'll have that right here, and then we'll have our mailbag on Friday. We'll have lots of stuff, and we'll have Morning Pitt videos every day of the week, Monday through Friday, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like this video and subscribe. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you had a great start to your week. We'll see if more commitments happen today. I don't think they will, but I got to say, during yesterday's Morning Pitt, I didn't think there were going to be commitments later in the day, so who knows? Who knows what might happen? Whatever does happen, stay tuned to Panther-Lair.com and YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So thanks again for tuning in. Hope you have a great Tuesday. We will talk to you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com.